Here are three true scary stories. Story number one. I still hear the screams. Even now, years later, in the silence of the night, they come back to me. Piercing, desperate. The sound of children calling for their mothers, of parents begging for their children's lives. The smell of burning flesh and gunpowder lingers in my mind, no matter how far I run from that place. I was there. I saw it all, and I survived. It was September 1st, 2004, the first day of school in Beslan. The morning was filled with laughter, children wearing their best clothes, teachers smiling as they welcomed their students. Parents gathered in the schoolyard, chatting and taking pictures, celebrating the new academic year. I remember holding my little brother's hand. He was only 6, his first year at school, and he clung to me nervously as we stood among the crowd. My mother had dressed him in his neat white shirt and black trousers. He was so excited that morning. Then the trucks came. At first, we thought they were late arrivals, maybe officials coming to give a speech. But when the doors opened, men poured out, armed, masked, their faces covered in black. They moved fast, yelling in Russian, firing their guns into the air. The crowd screamed. Parents tried to run, but they were too fast. I felt my mother's hand grab my wrist and pull me toward the school doors, but there was nowhere to go. The men were everywhere, surrounding us, forcing us inside. They herded us into the gymnasium. Hundreds of us, packed together, shoulder to shoulder. I could feel my brother trembling beside me, clutching my arm. My mother pressed my hand into his. "Don't let go," she whispered. The men, terrorists, I understood now, were shouting, setting up explosives along the walls and ceiling, stringing wires across the room. There were so many of us, children, teachers, parents, all staring at them in horror, not daring to move. I saw one of them shove a teacher to the floor and shoot him in the head. Just like that. His body twitched, and then he was still. "We are in control now," one of them said. "You will listen, or you will die." Time became meaningless in that gym. We stood there for hours, afraid to speak, afraid to move. The heat became unbearable, sweat soaking our clothes. The windows were shut, the air thick with the stench of fear. People started fainting. Children cried, their voices hoarse from thirst. We begged for water, but the terrorists just laughed. By the second day, people were drinking their own urine. Some whispered prayers. Others just stared ahead, their faces blank. My brother barely spoke, his lips cracked and dry. My mother held him close, rocking him back and forth, whispering to him, but her voice was weak. On the third day, the real horror began. We heard gunfire outside, rescue, we thought, hope swelling in our chests. But the terrorists panicked. They started shooting at the hostages, screaming at each other. Then a blast, a deafening explosion as one of their bombs went off, ripping through the gym. The roof collapsed, flames shooting up the walls. The heat was instant, unbearable. People ran, tripping over the dead and dying. Mothers threw themselves over their children, shielding them with their bodies. My mother did the same, covering my brother and me as debris rained down. Gunfire erupted. The Russian special forces had stormed the school. The terrorists fought back, using us as human shields. I saw a man grab a little girl and hold a gun to her head, but before he could fire, a bullet struck him, and he crumpled. The girl screamed, covered in his blood. The fire spread fast, the air filled with choking smoke. My mother was coughing, her grip on us weakening. Then I lost hold of my brother. Someone pushed past us, knocking him out of my grasp. I turned, saw his small figure in the chaos, his hands reaching for me, his mouth open in a silent cry. A moment later, an explosion threw me off my feet. My ears rang, my vision blurred. When I looked up, he was gone. I don't remember how I got out. Someone pulled me through the smoke, dragging me through shattered glass and bodies. When I stumbled into the open air, I collapsed. The school behind me was an inferno, the screams of those still inside rising into the sky. I searched for my family. My mother was found later, alive but burned, her arms wrapped around the body of another child, someone else's child. She thought it was my brother, but he never came out. In total, 334 people died that day. 186 of them were children. And I will never forget. Story number 2. I still hear the gunfire, the echoes of it, the sudden, sharp cracks that cut through the air, shattering the peace of an ordinary evening. I still see the bodies, lying in pools of blood, the shattered glass, the terrified faces, the way the city of Mumbai transformed from a place of life and light into a war zone. I was there. I survived the Mumbai attacks of 2008, but a part of me never truly left. It started like any other evening. I was at Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus, one of Mumbai's busiest train stations, waiting for my train home. The station was packed, as it always was, people moving in every direction, voices blending together into a familiar hum. I remember checking my phone, scrolling through messages, oblivious to the horror that was about to unfold. Then the first gunshot rang out. At first, people barely reacted. Maybe a firecracker, someone thought. Maybe just a loud noise. But then came another shot, and another. A scream, and suddenly, chaos. I turned my head toward the far side of the station, where the sound had come from. That's when I saw them. 2 men, dressed in dark clothes, carrying AK-47s, walking calmly through the station, and shooting everyone in their path. For a second, I was frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. People around me began to run, screaming, pushing, trampling over each other. The gunmen weren't yelling, weren't demanding anything. They were just killing, firing into the crowd without hesitation, without mercy. Then my body finally caught up with my mind, and I ran. The exits were jammed. Everyone was trying to flee at once, but the gunmen were moving methodically, cutting people down. I ducked behind a row of ticket counters, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the bullets tearing through flesh, the wet, sickening sound of bodies hitting the floor. A man next to me was whispering prayers under his breath, clutching his bag like it could somehow protect him. The shooting didn't stop. It just kept going. I peeked out just for a second. The floor was red with blood. Bodies lay sprawled, motionless. Some were still alive, moaning softly, reaching out for help that wouldn't come. I saw a mother shielding her child, both unmoving. A man crawling, leaving a streak of red behind him, before a final bullet silenced him. And then, one of the gunmen turned his head. He saw me. I didn't think. I just ran. I don't know how I made it through the crush of bodies, how I forced my way past the stampede of people trying to escape. Bullets whizzed past me, shattering glass, ricocheting off the steel beams. I stumbled, nearly fell, but somehow kept moving. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I ran and ran until I was outside, onto the streets of Mumbai. But the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The attacks weren't just at the train station. As I stumbled into the streets, I heard more gunfire, explosions in the distance. I saw flames rising from the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel, where more terrorists had stormed in, setting fires, executing hostages. I heard the wail of sirens, the panicked voices all around me, the sound of Mumbai unraveling. I had no idea where to go. Nowhere felt safe. The streets were crawling with police, their guns drawn, shouting at civilians to take cover. People huddled in alleyways, behind cars, in shops with their metal shutters pulled halfway down. I found shelter in a small cafe, the owner hurriedly locking the door behind me and the handful of others who had stumbled inside. We crouched in silence, listening to the gunfire outside, the distant screams. The television was on, showing live footage from the Taj, from Leopold Cafe, from Nariman House, where hostages were being held. The news anchor's voice was shaking. Mumbai was under attack. Hours passed. The gunfire didn't stop. I barely moved, barely breathed. Messages poured in on my phone. "Are you okay? Where are you?" But I couldn't bring myself to answer. I just kept staring at the screen, at the horror unfolding across the city. I saw hostages waving desperately from the windows of the Oberoi Hotel, begging for rescue. I saw masked men dragging bodies through hallways, executing tourists, staff, anyone they found. The reporters said some of the hostages had been tortured before being killed. And then there were the phone calls. The police intercepted communications between the gunmen and their handlers in Pakistan. The killers were laughing, joking, talking about how many people they had shot, how much destruction they had caused. They weren't hiding. They weren't afraid. They were enjoying it. The siege lasted 3 days. 3 days of blood, fire, and death. I don't know how I got home. When I finally did, I barely spoke for days. My family held me close, but I could barely process what had happened. I had seen too much. In the end, 175 people died. Over 300 were injured. And those were just the numbers we knew. Even today, when I pass the train station, when I walk by the Taj, I can still see it. The bodies, the blood, the terror. Some nights, I wake up sweating, the sound of gunfire ringing in my ears. Mumbai is still standing. The wounds have healed, but the scars remain. And so do the ghosts. Story number 3. I can still hear the music, the pounding bass, the electric energy of the crowd, the pulse of life running through the air. It was supposed to be a perfect night. It was supposed to be just another concert, just another moment of joy. And then the gunfire started. I was at the Bataclan Theater in Paris on November 13th, 2015. The Eagles of Death Metal were playing, and the venue was packed with 1,500 people. The air was hot, filled with the smell of beer, sweat, and excitement. People were laughing, dancing, shouting lyrics at the top of their lungs. I was standing near the middle of the crowd, my best friend beside me, both of us lost in the music. Then I heard what I thought was fireworks. It happened so fast. A loud popping sound, followed by another, then another. The music stopped. The band froze on stage, confusion flickering across their faces. The sound system crackled with feedback, and then people started falling, screaming. Chaos. I turned my head toward the back of the venue and saw them. 3 men in dark clothes, carrying rifles. They were firing into the crowd, not saying a word, just shooting methodically, without hesitation. For a second, I was frozen. My brain refused to process what was happening. Then the bodies hit the floor around me, and instinct took over. I grabbed my friend's arm and pulled her down. We hit the ground hard, my ears ringing from the gunfire. People were running, pushing, trampling over each other in blind panic. The screams were deafening. I could feel my friend shaking beside me, her fingers digging into my arm. We crawled. That was the only way to survive. We crawled over shattered beer bottles, over bodies, some still moving, some not. I could feel the warm stickiness of blood under my hands, but I didn't stop. If I stopped, I would die. A man next to me stood up, tried to run for the exit. A shot rang out, and he collapsed right in front of me. The gunmen were blocking the exits. They knew what they were doing. This wasn't some random shooting, it was a massacre. I could hear them talking. Calm, almost casual. One of them was reloading his gun, laughing. Another yelled something in Arabic. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Pure hate. Then they started taking hostages. I was one of them. They pulled me up by my hoodie, shoved me toward the stage where a group of us were being gathered. My friend was nowhere to be seen. My stomach lurched. Was she hiding? Was she dead? I couldn't think about that. I had to survive. We were forced to our knees, hands over our heads. The stench of blood was overpowering. The floor was slick with it, bodies piled in corners, people whimpering, dying. One of the terrorists started speaking. He was young, maybe in his 20s, maybe younger. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. He talked about revenge, about France paying for its sins, about how we were all part of the problem. Then he put his gun against the head of the man next to me and pulled the trigger. I flinched as blood splattered onto my arm, warm and sticky. The woman beside me let out a choked sob. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to be silent, still invisible. Then came the explosions. Outside, the rest of Paris was under attack. Bombs had gone off near the Stade de France. Gunmen were shooting people at cafes and restaurants. The city was falling apart, and we were at the center of it. The terrorists were watching the news on their phones, laughing. One of them even took a selfie with the bodies behind him. I wanted to be sick. Then, the police arrived. Gunfire erupted again. The gunmen started shouting orders, grabbing hostages as shields. I was pushed forward, my knees nearly buckling. I could hear glass shattering, bullets hitting the walls, people screaming. I don't remember how I escaped. One moment, I was in the grip of one of the gunmen. The next, I was running, stumbling over bodies, dodging bullets, blinded by tears and smoke. Someone grabbed my wrist, pulled me through a broken window, and suddenly I was outside, gasping for air, sirens wailing all around me. The street was a war zone, bodies everywhere, blood everywhere. The police were shouting orders, trying to control the chaos. Survivors were crying, calling for missing friends and family. I searched for my friend. I found her 3 days later. In the morgue, her body was riddled with bullets. She had died in the first few minutes of the attack. I had left her behind. I had crawled away, thinking she was right beside me, but she never made it out. In total, 130 people died that night. I should have been one of them, and maybe in a way I was, because the person I was before the Bataclan attack died that night too. I still wake up at night, hearing the screams. I still see the faces of the gunmen every time I close my eyes. I still wonder why I survived and she didn't. Paris has moved on. The Bataclan was rebuilt, but the ghosts are still there, and I am one of them.